Hello and welcome to another Big Finish video. Yes, it's been a while since I've talked about Big Finish and I thought it'd be quite nice to have a little bit of a break from reviewing the B&M set reviews. But they will continue next week in the form of the 12th Doctor set and the 1970 set, and there will be a Big Finish review in the form of Red Planets. But today's video is essentially recommendations, because Big Finish currently have a sale on the 4th Doctor Adventure, so from series 1 to 5 and a few of his special box sets. So I thought I would be one of those helpful YouTubers and give you some recommendations. I'm going to stress this point, some of the stories what appear on this list aren't necessarily my favourite, but some of the stories what appear on this list are part of the grand scheme of Big Finish, what tie into other Big Finish ranges. So I thought I'd just say that now, because I would like to do my top 10 4th Doctor adventures in the near future. But the way this video is going to work is I'm obviously going to give you a series guide, so I'm going to talk about the series, what are on offer and what you can expect if you want to get those series. And also I'll be giving you recommendations. That's basically this video, recommendations and a bit of a guide to the 4th Doctor adventures up until series 1 kicked off in January 2012, consisting of 6 stories: Destination Nerva, The Renaissance Man, The Wrath of the Iceni, Energy of the Daleks, Trail of the White Worm and The Asylum Adventure. Now series 1 of the 4th Doctor adventures was going to feature Elizabeth Sladen and Nicholas Courtney, but because they sadly passed away, the series had to change and become adapted for Leela. Now you can obviously tell in certain stories that it would have been Sarah Jane, but other stories like The Wrath of the Iceni, you can see that it was definitely made. Now series 1 did feature heavy criticism in the form of nostalgia, because nostalgia is a very dangerous thing, and series 1 definitely relied on nostalgia in the form of Destination Nerva being set on Nerva Beacon and being set directly after the Talons of Weng-Chiang. Move on to the next 2 stories, they're fine, but move on to the 4th story, Energy of the Daleks. We have the Daleks, and then obviously the last 2 stories featuring the Master and the Kralls. Moving on to series 2 now, which featured the 4th Doctor and Romana 1. Personally, my favourite out of the 4th Doctor adventures. It's my favourite series what Big Finish have done to date, and if you want to know my full thoughts on this series, I have done an overview of this series, much like series 1, and I'll leave a link in the description below. So series 2 contained 7 stories, so we had an extra story in 2013. So we kicked off with the Antimatter, the Sands of Life, and we had War Against Valan, which is essentially a 4-part story. So if you get Sands of Life, you'll need to get War Against Valan. We saw the 4th Doctor reunite with his trusty friends from the Talons of Weng-Chiang, Jago and Lightfoot. Then we had the eerie, ghostly story in the forms of Phantoms of the Deep. Then we had the series finale in the form of the Dalek Contract, and the final phase, much like the Sands of Life and War Against Valan and the Asylum Adventure and Trail of the White Worm. That is essentially a 4-part story spread across 2 CDs, and if you are going to get series 5, you're going to be wanting to get these 2 stories and these 2 stories as well, because of a certain character played by David Warner, played Cuthbert, because this series does reoccur in the form of series 5, which I'll talk about later on. So moving on to series 3 now, we had 8 stories, and this very much became the same for series 4 and series 5. And then series 6 we got 9 releases. Now series 3 is a bit more interesting because, like I said, we had, you normally get a release where it is 2 stories. You essentially get 1 story what is spread across 2 releases. Series 3 has none of that. It is essentially just 8 one-hour stories: King of Sontar, White Ghost, The Crooked Man, The Evil One, Last of the Colophon, Destroy the Infinite, The Abandoned, which is written by Nigel Fairs and Louise Jameson, and the series concluded with Zygon Hunt. Now series 3 is quite interesting because it started to develop Leela a lot more, because we began this teacher-student relationship with the 4th Doctor, and all the 4th Doctor and Leela releases ever since have had that teacher-student dynamic. So moving on to series 4, now this is when we get the 4th Doctor, Leela and K9, and K9 first appeared in series 2, and ever since series 4 he's appeared in the 4th Doctor adventures. So let's look at the stories within this series. So the series kicked off with the Exelons, which is a prequel to Death to the Daleks. So if you like Death to the Daleks, then you might want to get the Exelons. Then the second story, The Darkness of Glass. Then we have the Requiem of the Rocket Men, which is a very interesting story because it plays with the Master being the good guy. Now, Requiem for the Rocket Men does sort of loosely link into a story called Deathmatch, which is the next story along, but personally it's not that good, to be honest. Then we have Suburban Hell, which is, one of my least favourite Fourth Doctor adventures. Then we have the Cloisters of Terror, which is excellent. And then we have the series finale, the Fate of Krelos. And then we have the Return to Telos. So these two stories are essentially one story spread across 2 releases. On to Series 5 now. Now, Series 5 is quite a surprising series in the form that we saw Tom Baker reunite with Lalla Ward. Now, obviously, the novel adaptations happened and we saw those two pair up, but we never thought we would see an actual series featuring those two. So let's look at the stories for Series 5. Now, Series 5, I've got to be honest, is one of my personal favourite Fourth Doctor Adventure series because it is just a lot of fun. So it's kicked off with the Wave of Destruction and continued with the Labyrinth of Buddha Castle, one of my favourite Fourth Doctor adventures. Then the third and fourth story, the Paradox Planet and the Legacy of Death, is another prime example of one story spread across 2 releases, which is a very Douglas Adams style story. Then we had the Gallery of Ghouls by Alan Barnes, and then we had Trouble with Drax, which obviously sees the Fourth Doctor re-encounter Drax from the Armageddon Factor. Then we had the Cuthbert series finale, again, which I said links back to the previous Cuthbert stories with the Pursuit of History and the Casualties of Time. So that was your series guide of the Fourth Doctor adventures from Series 1 to Series 5. Now, of course, this offer does include box sets, so I thought I'd kick off this recommendation section with a bang, with this box set. Philip Hinchcliffe Presents. Now, this is a very pricey box set normally on Big Finish. It's normally £55, and I believe that this box set is on offer for £25. So this is an absolute steal because it is essentially a 6-part story in the form of The Ghost of Growlstead and the 4-part story called The Devil's So the way this box set works is essentially Philip Hinchcliffe has an idea and goes, right, Mark Platt, you can write that for me. And of course, Mark Platt is a very safe writer because he's very prolific in terms of Big Finish. And this is probably your best representation of the Philip Hinchcliffe range. The other 2 stories, Helm of War and Genesis Chamber, aren't as good as these. So let's talk about the stories themselves. So The Ghost of Growlstead, the best way to describe that story is the Talons of Weng-Chiang. And of course, that's caused quite a bit of stir on the internet recently, but who cares? Talons of Weng-Chiang is one of the best Tom Baker stories. It's just beautiful. But The Ghost of Growlstead is essentially the Talons of Weng-Chiang. It's set in Victorian London, and you have a villain very similar to Magnus Greel. The only criticism I have for The Ghost of Growlstead is the form of episode 5. It just randomly goes to Africa, I think, and you're just like, oh, that's kind of lost all the atmosphere and tension the story's built up. But in episode 6 it does come back because they go back to Victorian times. So it is one of those weird ones, but other than that, Ghost of Growlstead is utterly brilliant. Now, The Devil's Armada is the 4-part release in this box set, and it's probably my favourite out of the 2 stories. I just love it, as we see the 4th Doctor and Leela in Tudor England. So it's kind of a pseudo-historical box set, which is quite interesting. But I love it because it's basically the 4th Doctor battling with imps and demons. It is just a really good story, and you can really imagine it, and you can definitely tell that Philip Hinchcliffe's going, well, this isn't on TV, so I can be a bit more bold with the ideas I have. And I think it's part 2 or part 3's cliffhanger is just superb. I absolutely love this box set, and it's definitely worth the £25 price tag. So my next recommendation is this, the 4th Doctor Lost Stories box set containing 2 stories, Foe from the Future and the Valley of Death. Much like Philip Hinchcliffe Presents, it has the same format in the form of a 6-part story and a 4-part story. And again, this has a hefty price tag when it's not on sale, and it's definitely worth the price they're offering it on sale. So what are the stories themselves? So Foe from the Future is a brilliant post-apocalyptic story in the form of humans escaping that apocalypse by going back into the past, and it's a very interesting one, and it does share a few similar ideas to the Talons of Weng-Chiang in the form of the villain being very much disfigured, but that's what I'm going to say on that. And obviously this story was going to be where the Talons of Weng-Chiang was going to be. It was going to be the season 14 finale, and I'm very much glad that Foe from the Future never happened and we got Talons of Weng-Chiang instead, because obviously we got Jagon Lightfoot. But I don't think the TV show could have realised how big and bold this story is, and it just didn't have the budget to do this story. And obviously this story is an idea based from Robert Stewart Banks, who wrote Terror of the Zygons and The Seeds of Doom, 2 prolific 4th Doctor adventures, so you know it's going to be an absolute cracking story. The final offering in the Lost Stories box set is the Valley of Death. Now this is kind of a precursor to the Philip Hinchcliffe Presents box set because it is an idea by Philip Hinchcliffe and is written by Jonathan Morris, so a very good pairing in my eyes. And I think in some DVD extras you can hear him talking about the concept for this, the idea he had for this, but obviously it just never come into fruition. So what you end up with this story is a very high quality Doctor adventure set in the 1970s, with Unit making an appearance towards the end of it, and it has a very thick multi-layered plot that makes this a much more interesting story than your standard Doctor Who offering. There are at least 3 sub-stories that twist and combine in the end act to conclude. A very enjoyable way to spend 2 hours, but it's certainly not as good as Foe from the Future, but still it's a very good story, and the writing talents of Jonathan Morris and the idea by Philip Hinchcliffe present, it is just a perfect. So moving on to recommendations from the 4th Doctor individual series now. So we're kicking off with Destination Nerva. Well, Nerva. What a better place to kick off with the actual start of the 4th Doctor series with Destination Nerva. Obviously, like I said, this is set after the talent of Weng Chiang and set on Nerva Beacon. Now, if you love the Ark in Space, then you're probably going to like this one, because it's basically the Ark in Space version 2, because it is very similar. You have body horror and people being consumed by a villain called Vidrell, I think. So yeah, it is very similar to the Ark in Space, so a pretty safe way to kick off the series, and is an enjoyable release. I give that release an 8 out of 10. Wrath at the IC now. If you love Leela, then you're gonna love this. This is a absolutely fantastic story, because we see the Noble Savage team up with the Warrior Queen Boudica. This is a pure historical story, and I think that it's the only example of a pure historical within this series, and it is just the best representation of the teacher and student relationship in series 1, because series 3 really started to develop that idea. But it is just a wonderful story, because we see Leela turn against the Doctor and stand with Boudica, so it's quite interesting to see how the 4th Doctor reacts and copes with that. And is very much like the Aztecs, you know, the 4th Doctor going to Leela, look, you can't do this, history is a fixed point, you can't change it. You know, it is just absolutely wonderful. It's just a brilliant story. If you love Leela, then you're gonna want to get this story. It's just a fantastic pure historical adventure, which I give a 9 out of 10. Now, my final recommendation from series 1 would be Energy of the Daleks. It's just a brilliant story. It was the first 4th Doctor adventure I got, so it has a special place in my heart, and also got a vinyl release this year. So I'm not going to talk too much about the story, because I've basically talked about it already this year, but believe me, it is a fantastic story. It's my favourite story from series 1. It is just an absolute cracker. It's got Clive from, well, the person who plays Clive from Rose, who is just magnificent, and is just a real great story. I just love the opening to this story. It's just superb, and the Daleks are just at their best, you know, in the shadows while their plan unfolds. It's just a brilliant story. My recommendation from series 2 are this. Series 2. Literally, I recommend all of series 2. It is just absolutely fantastic. It is my favourite 4th Doctor series. You know, the Antimatter is probably my least favourite within the series. I give that one a 4 out of 10. But you may like it. I seem to be the only person who doesn't like it. It's by Jonathan Morris, who normally does dark, you know, nitty-gritty stories, but this is very much a comedy, fits beautifully into the Key to Time series, and is very much a parody of Jeeves and Wooster. Now, the next story, The Sands of Life, is a 3-part story. It is essentially a 3-part 4th Doctor adventure. I believe it is the only example of that, and it is just absolutely beautiful. And it's very much set up the sort of Cuthbert sort of stuff, what happens in series 5 with the parrot and the TARDIS. It's very much linked into the series 5 finale, and obviously introduces us to Cuthbert, and it's just a really good story. And obviously that continues in War Against Valarn, which is again a brilliant story. I really do like those 2 stories. So the next story in series 2 is The Justice of Jauxo. We see the 4th Doctor reunite with Henry Gordon Jago and Professor George Lightfoot. In this release, it is just magnificent. It is just so brilliant. You see sort of Jago just get really excited taking Romana 1 out for like a meal. It is just brilliant. It has this really great sort of steampunk vibe to it. It's just a brilliant story. Phantoms of the Deep is just a really eerie, claustrophobic adventure, which is just done brilliantly. It's by Jonathan Morris, so it's going to be naturally moving on brilliant. To the series 2 finale, which is The Dalek Contract, and the final phase, again featuring Cuthbert, which does link into the series 5. And my god, this is one of my favourite 4th Doctor adventure stories. It's just utterly brilliant. The music just seems like Dudley Simpson scored this himself. It's brilliant. They've got some great imagery of K9 just wandering across the snow, and the music what goes with that is just superb. The story is amazing. You know, the Fourth Doctor belittling the Daleks, it's great. And the Daleks are just wonderful within this. Obviously the story just clashes with continuity, but who cares? It is just an utterly brilliant thing. And obviously, if you want to know my full thoughts on each story in more depth in Series 2, then check out my overview video, which I will leave a link in the description below so you can check out my full in-depth thoughts on these 2 stories. So moving on to the Series 3 recommendations now in the form of the King of Sontar. Again, an absolutely classic story. It is just a brilliant way to open a series, and is by John Dorney, so you can expect marvellous things. Now obviously this story again does clash with continuity with Leela meeting the Sontarans, but this is an absolutely worthy addition to go, who cares about continuity in canon? But who cares when you have a Sontaran called Strang, who is essentially this super Sontaran. He's basically the power of 8 Sontarans, or like a power of an entire clone batch of Sontarans. It's something like that. It's been a while since I've listened to this story, but believe me, it is utterly brilliant and is one story you do not want to miss. It is just a fan favourite for the Fourth Doctor adventures. So my next recommendation from Series 3 is The Crooked Man. Now this isn't one of my favourite Fourth Doctor adventures, but I thought I'd put it on the list simply because of the villain, the Crooked Man. Now I believe that he was a lot more darker and more gruesome, and sounded a lot more deranged in the performance by the person who played the Crooked Man. But Nick Briggs thought, let's tone him down, which I think is a real shame, because I would have just thought, you know what, let's just keep him as he is. Let's make him one of the most terrifying Doctor Who villains out there. And within the story, he does have some utterly terrifying moments. The concept behind the Crooked Man is utterly brilliant. The way he kills people is just horrific. And the scenes between the Doctor and Leela are utterly brilliant, you know, in this sort of deserted seaside town. Is just wonderful. And part 2 has a very interesting concept, because we do return to the land of fiction, but what happens to the bad fairy tales? What happens to the monsters within the fairy tales? So it's a very interesting idea on that, and I'll let you, if you want to get this release, I'll let you discover that for yourself. So yes, The Crooked Man, not one of my favourites, but it's certainly an interesting addition to the Fourth Doctor adventure lineup. Now the final Series 3 story I'm going to recommend is Destroy the Infinite. Now, if you know that series called Dark Eyes, you know, that series, that highly popular Big Finish series, well, this kind of links into that in the form of the villain called the Eminence, because there are 2 stories outside Dark Eyes where the Eminence feature, which is Destroy the Infinite and Seeds of War, which is basically the Eminence's origin story. So this is quite a nice little precursor to the Dark Eyes saga with the Eminence. The story itself is really good. It is a wonderful story, and it is a fan favourite story, so you can only expect great things. And if you have listened to some of the Dark Eyes stuff, or you want to get into Dark Eyes and sort of you want to know about the Eminence, then this might be a nice little place to start off with. Series 4 recommendations with the Darkness of Glass. Now this has been one of my favourite Fourth Doctor adventures ever since I listened to this back in 2015. I keep saying that these are my favourite Fourth Doctor adventures, but truly this is a wonderful release from the Fourth Doctor range. It does feel very much of a product of its time. It feels very much like you can put this in the Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes era. It does feel like a story devised by those two. And Justin Richards has captured that theme very well. It's very gothic horror. You know, the use of isolation is fantastic. But the only major criticism I have for this story is the monster. You know, they literally just call this story, the monster within this story, a demon. You know, if this story was a 4-part, you know, you can see that that demon creature would have a lot more expansion and obviously have a few more things done to it. But because this is an hour long story, you can't have that, which is a real shame. But The Darkness of Glass is definitely fantastic. Tom Baker has some wonderful one-liners within this, and it's definitely a story I highly recommend. So moving on to my final recommendation from Series 4, which is The Fate of Krelos and Return to Telos. Now, Fate of Krelos is very much set up to Return to Telos. You do need to get these 2 stories to understand them, because they do heavily link, because this story does continue right from the off with Return to Telos. But yeah, Fate of Krelos is very much set up, you know, setting up the characters, the world, and that kind of thing. It is very much set up. It does have a mystery, you know, that, you know, what has happened to this planet. But then Return to Telos happens, is where you get the big side of the action, and we see the Fourth Doctor with the Tomb of the Cybermen. Now, Return to Telos is very much a straight continuation from The Fate of Krelos, with the TARDIS being dragged towards a planet, and something has happened to K9. But yeah, it's a very interesting story. The story itself is very much a Marmite one. Some people really love it, some people hate it, but I absolutely adore it. I think that it's a wonderful story. The Cybermen are at their best. You've got them smashing through walls, you know, on this sort of, you can just imagine this planet just being destroyed by the Cybermen. They're just utterly ruthless within this. And we do have some little scenes from Tomb of the Cybermen, and we do have a little cameo appearance of the Second Doctor and Jamie. So it is a very interesting way, and the ending for this series is utterly beautiful, and it's just a wonderful release. So if you do want to get Return to Telos, you are going to have to get Fate of Krelos, because it does heavily rely on you listening to Fate of Krelos to understand Return to Telos. Moving on to the final series of Fourth Doctor adventures what are on offer, which is Series 5 with the Fourth Doctor and Romana 2. Now, the Wave of Destruction, I'm going to be honest, was a story I was quick to judge. When it was first released, I was like, this story doesn't sound like my type of story I would enjoy. But I was so wrong. I was so pleasantly surprised on how excellent this story is. You know, it is just, the best way to describe this story is fun. Because you've got Romana and K9 basically becoming DJs on this pirate radio station, which is fantastic. We have a monster from the Fourth Doctor TV series being redeemed by Big Finish, what they have redeemed in the past, and they fit the story rather well. Obviously, I'm not going to say what villain it is, because obviously that is one of the key moments within the story with the villain being revealed. But honestly, Wave of Destruction is just a fun story. It's just an incredible story. It does link into the Black Guardian rather well. Moving on to my favourite story from Series 5, which is The Labyrinth of Buddha Castle by Eddie Robson. The best way to describe this story is very much like the City of Death. You can just picture this being part of Season 17 with the Fourth Doctor and Romana just wandering around Budapest. It is utterly fantastic, and I'm an absolute sucker for Doctor Who vampire stories, no pun intended. It's just a really nice precursor to the State of Decay, even though it doesn't really link into that. It's just a wonderful story, has a great atmosphere to it. And again, you know, if you want to see my full thoughts on this story, check out my review. I'll leave a link in the description below. It's just a really fantastic story. I just love The Labyrinth of Buddha Castle. It's just magnificent. Now, my final recommendation from the Fourth Doctor individual series is Trouble with Drax. Now, you know when people say a story's really fun and clever? Well, that's that. This story is incredibly clever. It's full of so many twists and turns. It is a game of cat and mouse, and seeing Drax back is incredible, and the twist involving Drax is really good. I didn't see it coming. It is just a really fun, clever story, what really does fit in well with Season 17. Honestly, I don't want to say too much about this story, because if I go in depth with this story, I will spoil it, but it is just, well, just believe me, it is a really clever, fun adventure. So my final recommendation I'm going to recommend within this video is the Well-Mannered War. Now, obviously you can get Well-Mannered War on its own, or you can get the limited edition one containing damaged goods. But the Well-Mannered War is so good. It is just an utterly brilliant Fourth Doctor adventure. Obviously it's based from a Virgin Missing adventure, but believe me, the Well-Mannered War is fun. It's just an utterly brilliant story. It is a fantastic 4-part adventure. We see K9 running for president, and obviously Romana is dressed as the Third Doctor, so that's lovely. But the story is great. The Salations return, and they're really wonderful, and it's just a really interesting concept behind it, this really well-mannered war. That's literally it. These two sides, well, they don't really know why they're fighting, but they're fighting. It's just really odd to see a war be so polite. It is just a wonderful adventure with the Fourth Doctor, Romana, so that concludes this recommendation video. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you find that these recommendations are helpful for you, and hopefully if you are thinking of getting Fourth Doctor adventures, I've kind of helped you out a bit. And obviously if you've got these adventures on the shelf and you haven't listened to them, then hopefully that might inspire you to pick it up and give it a listen, give it a go. So yeah, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next video, which will be a review of the 12th Doctor B&M set featuring Missy, the 12th Doctor, and of course Bill Potts. So I'll see you later on in that video, later on in the week. So thank you very much, and goodbye.